Chapter 1. An Unexpected Party. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit, not a nasty, dirty, wet hole filled with the ends of worms and a oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down on or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. It had a perfectly round door like a porthole, painted green, with a shiny yellow brass knob in the exact middle. The door opened onto a tube-shaped hall like a tunnel, a very comfortable tunnel without smoke, with paneled walls and floors steel and carpeted, provided with polished chairs and lots of pegs for hats and coats. The hobbit was fond of visitors. The tunnel went on and on, going fairly but not quite straight into the side of the hill. The hill, as all the people for many miles round called it, and many little round doors opened out of it, first on one side and then on another. No going upstairs for the hobbit. Bedrooms, bathrooms, cellar, pantries, lot of these, wardrobes. He had whole rooms devoted to clothes, kitchens, dining rooms, all were on the same floor, and indeed on the same passage. The bedrooms were all on the left-hand side, going in, for these were the only ones to have windows, deep-set, round windows looking over his garden, and meadows beyond, sloping down to the river.
This hobbit was a very well-to-do hobbit, and his name was Baggins. The Bagginses had lived in the neighborhood of the hill for time out of mind, and people considered them very respectable, not only because most of them were rich, but also because they never had any adventures or did anything unexpected. You could tell what a Baggins would say on any question without the bother of asking him. This is the story of how a Baggins had an adventure, and found himself doing and saying things altogether unexpected. He may have lost the neighborhood's respect, but he gained, well, you will see whether he gained anything in the end. The mother of our particular hobbit. What is a hobbit? I suppose hobbits need some descriptions nowadays, since they have become rare and shy of the big people, as they call us. They are, or were, a little people, about half our height and smaller than the bearded dwarfs. Hobbits have no beards. There is little or no magic about them, except the ordinary everyday sort which help them to disappear quietly and quickly when large, stupid folk like you and me come blundering along, making a noise like elephants which they can hear a mile off. They are inclined to be fat in the stomach. They dress in bright colors, chiefly green and yellow. Wear no shoes because their feet grow natural leathery soles and thick warm brown hair like the stuff on their heads, which is curly, have long clever brown fingers, good-natured faces, and laugh deep fruity laughs, especially after dinner, which they have twice a day when they can get it. Now you know enough to go on with. As I was saying, the mother of this hobbit, of Bilbo Baggins that is, was the famous Belladonna Took, one of the three remarkable daughters of the old Took, head of the hobbits who lived across the water, the small river that ran at the foot of the hill. It was often said, in other families, that long ago one of the Took ancestors must have taken a fairy wife. That was, of course, absurd, but certainly there was still something not entirely hobbit-like about them, and once in a while members of the Took clan would go and they discreetly disappear, and the family hushed it up. But the fact remained that the Tooks were not as respectable as the Bagginses, though they were undoubtedly richer.
Not that Belladonna Took ever had any adventures after she became Mrs. Bongo Baggins. Bongo, that was Bilbo's father, built the most luxurious hobbit hole for her, and partly with her money, that was to be found either under the hill or over the hill or across the water. And there they remained to the end of their days. Still, it is probable that Bilbo, her only son, although he looked and behaved exactly like a second edition of his solid and comfortable father, got something a bit queer in his makeup from the Took side, something that only waited for a chance to come out. The chance never arrived until Bilbo Baggins was grown up. Being about 50 years old or so, and living in the beautiful hobbit hole built by his father, which I have just described for you, until he had, in fact, apparently settled down immovably. By some curious chance one morning long ago in the quiet of the world, when there was less noise and more green, and the hobbits were still numerous and prosperous, and Bilbo Baggins was standing at his door after breakfast smoking an enormous long wooden pipe that reached nearly down to his woolly toes, neatly brushed, Gandalf came by. Gandalf, if you had ever heard a quarter of what I have heard about him, and I have only heard very little of all there is to hear, you would be prepared for any sort of remarkable tale. Tales and adventures sprouted up all over the place wherever he went, in the most extraordinary fashion. He had not been down that way under the hill for ages and ages, not since his friend the old Took died, in fact, and the hobbits had almost forgotten what he looked like. He had been away over the hill and across the water on businesses of his own since they were all small hobbit boys and hobbit girls. All that the unsuspecting Bilbo saw that morning was an old man with a staff. He had a tall pointed blue hat, a long grey cloak, a silver scarf over which his long white beard hung down below his waist, and immense black
Good morning,
boots.
said Bilbo, and he meant it. The sun was shining, and the grass was very green. But Gandalf looked at him from under long bushy eyebrows that stuck out further than the brim of his shady hat.
"What do you mean?"
He said,
"Do you wish me a good morning, or mean that it is a good morning whether I want it or not? Or that you feel good this morning, or that it is a morning to be good on?"
all of them at once,
said Bilbo.
and a very fine morning for a pipe of tobacco out of doors into the bargain. If you have a pipe about you, sit down and have a fill of mine. There's no hurry. We have all the day before us.
Then Bilbo sat down on a seat by his door, crossed his legs, and blew out a beautiful great ring of smoke that sailed up into the air without breaking and floated away over the hill.
"Very pretty,
Said Gandalf.
but I have no time to blow smoke rings this morning. I am looking for someone to share in an adventure that I am arranging, and it's very difficult to find anyone."
I should parts. We are plain, quiet folk and have no use for adventures. Nasty, disturbing, uncomfortable things. Make you late for dinner. I can't think what anybody sees in them.
Said Mr. Baggins, and stuck one thumb behind his braces and blew out another even bigger smoke ring. Then he took out his morning letters and began to read, pretended to take no more notice of the old man. He had decided that he was not quite his sort and wanted him to go away. But the old man did not move. He stood leaning on his stick and gazing at the hobbit without saying anything, till Bilbo got quite uncomfortable and even a little cross.
Good morning.
He said at last.
We don't want any adventures here. Thank you. You might try over the hill or across the water.
By this, he meant that the conversation was at an end.
"What a lot of things do you use good morning for?"
Said Gandalf.
"Now you mean that you want to get rid of me, and that it won't be good till I move off."
Not at all, my dear sir. Let me see. I don't think I know your name.
Yes, yes, my dear sir, and I do know your name, Mr. Bilbo Baggins, and you do know my name, though you don't remember that I belong to it. I am Gandalf, and Gandalf means me. To think that I should have lived to be good morning by Belladonna took son, as if I was selling buttons at the door.
Gandalf? Gandalf? Good gracious me! Not the wandering wizard that gave old Took a pair of magic diamond studs that fastened themselves and never came undone till ordered? Not the fellow who used to tell such wonderful tales at parties about dragons and goblins and giants and the rescue of princesses and the unexpected luck of widows' sons? Not the man that used to make such particularly excellent fireworks? I remember those. Old Took used to have them on Midsummer's Eve. Splendid! They used to go up like great lilies and snapdragons and laburnums of fire and hang in the twilight all evening.
You will notice already that Mr. Baggins was not quite so prosy as he liked to believe. Also, that he was very fond of flowers.
Dear me!
He went on.
Not the Gandalf who was responsible for so many quiet lads and lasses going off into the blue for mad adventures, anything from climbing trees to visiting elves, or sailing in ships sailing to other shores. Bless me, life used to be quiet you used to upset things badly in these parts once upon a time. I beg your pardon, but I had no idea you were still in business.
"Where else should I be?"
said the wizard.
"All the same, I am pleased to find you remember something about me. You seem to remember my fireworks kindly, at any rate. and that is not without hope. Indeed, for your old grandfather Tuk's sake, and for the sake of the poor belladonna, I will give you what you asked for.
I beg your pardon. I haven't asked for anything.
Yes, you have. Twice now. My pardon. I give it to you. In fact, I will go so far as to send you on this adventure. Very amusing for me, very good for you, and profitable too, very likely if you ever get over it.
Sorry, I don't want any adventures. Thank you. Not today. Good morning. But please come to tea, any time you like. Why not tomorrow? Come tomorrow. Goodbye.
With that, the hobbit turned and scuttled inside his round green door, and shut it as quickly as he dared, not to seem rude. Wizards, after all, are wizards,
What on earth did I ask him to tea for?
he said to himself as he went to the pantry. He had only just had breakfast, but he thought a cake or two and a drink of something would do him good after his fright. Gandalf, in the meantime, was still standing outside the door and laughing loud but quietly. After a while he stepped up, and with the spike of his staff scratched a queer sign of the hobbit's beautiful green front door. Then he strode away, just about the time when Bilbo was finishing his second cake and beginning to think that he had escaped adventures very well. The next day he had almost forgotten about Gandalf. He did not remember things very well, unless he put them down on his engagement tablet like this: Gandalf Tea Wednesday. Yesterday he had been too flustered to do anything of the kind. Just before tea time there came a tremendous ring on the front door bell, and then he remembered. He rushed and put on the kettle, and put out another cup and saucer, and an extra cake or two, and ran to the door.
I am so sorry to keep you waiting.
He was going to say, when he saw that it was not Gandalf at all. It was a dwarf with a blue beard tucked into a golden belt, and very bright eyes under his dark green hood. As soon as the door was opened, he pushed inside just as if he had been expected. He hung his hooded cloak on the nearest peg and,
"Dwelling, at your service,"
he said with a low bow.
Bilbo Baggins, at yours.
Said the hobbit, too surprised to ask any question for the moment. When the silence that followed had become uncomfortable, he added,
I am just about to take tea. Pray come and have some with me.
a little stiff perhaps, but he meant it kindly. And what would you do if an uninvited dwarf came and hung his things up in your hall without a word of explanation? They had not been at table long. In fact, they had hardly reached the third take, when there came another even louder ring at the bell.
Excuse me.
said the hobbit, and off he went to the door.
So you have got here at last.
That was what he was going to say to Gandalf this time, but it was not Gandalf. Instead, there was a very old-looking dwarf on the step with a white beard and a scarlet hood, and he too hopped inside as soon as the door was open.
I see they have begun to arrive already,
He said when he caught sight of Dwalin's green hood hanging up. He hung his red one next to it, and
Balin at your service.
he said with his hand on his breast.
Thank you.
Said Bilbo with a gasp. It was not the correct thing to say, but they had begun to arrive had flustered him badly. He liked visitors, but he liked to know them before they arrived, and he preferred to ask them himself. He had a horrible thought that the cakes might run short, and then he, as the host, he knew his duty and stuck to it however painful. He might have to go without.
Come along in and have some tea.
He managed to say after taking a deep breath.
A little beer will suit me better, if it is all the same to you, my good sir.
Said Balin with the white beard.
But I don't mind some seed cake, if you have any.
Lots.
Bilbo found himself answering to his own surprise, and he found himself scuttling off too to the cellar to fill a pint beer mug, and then to a pantry to fetch 2 beautiful round seed cakes which he had baked that afternoon for his after-supper morsel. When he got back, Balin and Dwalin were talking at the table like old friends. As a matter of fact, they were brothers. Bilbo plumped down the beer and the cake in front of them, when loud came a ring at the bell again, and then another ring.
Gamble for certain this time.
He thought as he puffed along the passage, but it was not. It was two more dwarfs, both with blue hoods, silver bells, and yellow beards, and each of them carried a bag of tools and a spade. And they whooped as soon as the door began to open. Bilbo was hardly surprised at all.
What can I do for you, my dwarfs?
He said.
Gilly at your service,
Said the one,
And Philly,
added the other, and they both swept off their blue hoods and bowed.
At yours and your families.
Replied Bilbo, remembering his manners this time.
Dwelling and Balin here already, I see.
Said Killy,
Let us join the throng.
Strong?
thought Mr. Baggins.
I don't like the sound of that. I really must sit down for a minute and collect my wits and have a drink.
He had only just had a sip in the corner, while the four dwarfs sat around the table and talked about mines and gold and troubles with the goblins and the depredations of dragons and lots of other things which he did not understand and did not want to, for they sounded much too adventurous, when ding-dong and ling-dong his bell rang again, and if some naughty little hobbit boy was trying to pull the handle off.
Someone at the door.
He said, blinking.
some four, I should say by the sound.
Said Philly.
Besides, we saw them coming along behind us in the distance.
The poor little hobbit sat down in the hall and put his head in his hands and wondered what had happened, and what was going to happen, and whether they would all stay to supper. Then the bell rang again louder than ever, and he had to run to the door. It was not 4 after all, it was 5. Another dwarf had come along while he was wandering in the hall. He had hardly turned the knob before they were all inside, bowing and saying, "At your service," one after another. Dory, Nori, Ori, Oin, and Gloin were their names, and very soon 2 purple hoods, a grey hood, a brown hood, and a white hood were hanging off the pegs, and off they marched with their broad hands stuck in their gold and silver belts to join the others. Already it had almost become a throng. Some called for ale, and some for porter, and one for coffee, and all of them for cakes, so the hobbit was kept very busy for a while. A big jug of coffee had just been set in the hearth, the seed cakes were gone, and the dwarfs were starting on a run of water scones, when there came a loud knock. Not a ring, but a hard rat-tat on the hobbit's beautiful green door. Somebody was banging with a stick. Bilbo rushed along the passage, very angry, and altogether bewildered and bewildered. This was the most awkward Wednesday he ever remembered. He pulled open the door with a jerk, and they all fell in, one on top of the other. More dwarfs! 4 more! And there was Gandalf behind, leaning on his staff and laughing. He had made quite a dent on the beautiful door. He had also, by the way, knocked out the secret mark that he had put there the morning before.
Carefully, carefully,
He said.
It's not like you, Bilbo, to keep friends waiting on the mat, and then open the door like a popgun. Let me introduce Bifur, Boffer, Bumber, and especially Thorin.
At your service, said Bifur, Buffer, and Bumber, standing in a row. Then they hung up 2 yellow hoods and a pale green one, and also a sky blue one with a long silver tassel. This lamp belonged to Thorin, an enormously important dwarf. In fact, no other than the great Thorin Oakenshield himself, who was not at all pleased at falling flat on Bilbo's man with Bifur, Buffer, and Bumper on top of him. For one thing, Bumper was immensely fat and heavy. Thorin indeed was very haughty, and said nothing about service, but poor Mr. Baggins said he was sorry so many times that at last he grunted
Pray don't mention it.
and stopped frowning.
Now we're all here,
Said Gandalf, looking at the row of 13 hoods, the best detachable party hoods, and his own hat hanging on the pegs.
Quite a merry gathering. I hope there is something left for our latecomers to eat and drink. What's that? Tea? No, thank you. A little red wine, I think, for me.
And for me.
Said Thorin,
And raspberry jam and apple tart.
said Bifur, and mince pies and cheese, said Buffer,
And pork pie and salad.
said Bombur, and more cakes,
An ale.
And coffee.
If you don't mind.
called the other dwarfs through the door.
Put on a few eggs. There's a good fellow.
Gandalf called after him as the hobbit stamped off to the pantries.
And just bring out the cold chicken and pickles.
Seems to know as much about the inside of my larders as I do myself.
Thought Mr. Baggins, who was feeling positively flummoxed and was beginning to wonder whether a most-wretched adventure had not come right into his house. By the time he had got all the bottles and dishes and knives and forks and glasses and plates and spoons and things piled up on big trays, he was getting very hot and red in the face and annoyed.
Confusticate and be bothered, these dwarfs.
He said aloud.
Why don't they come and lend a hand?
Lo and behold, there stood Balin and Dwalin at the door of the kitchen, and Philly and Killy behind them. And before he could say knife, they had whisked the trays and a couple of small tables into the parlor and set out everything afresh. Gandalf sat at the head of the party with the 13 dwarfs all round, and Bilbo sat on a stool at the fireside, nibbling at a biscuit. His appetite was quite taken away, and trying to look as if this was all perfectly ordinary and not in the least an adventure. The dwarfs ate, and talked, and time got on. At last they pushed their chairs back, and Bilbo made a move to collect their plates and glasses.
I suppose you will all stay to supper.
He said in his politest, unpressing tones.
Of course.
Said Thorin.
And after. We shan't get through the business till late, and we must have some music first. Now to clear up.
Thereupon the 12 dwarfs, not Thorin, he was too important, and stayed talking to Gandalf, jumped to their feet and made tall piles of all the things. Off they went, not waiting for trays, balancing columns of plates, each with a bottle on the top, with one hand, while the hobbit ran after them, almost squeaking with fright.
Please be careful.
And
Please don't trouble. I can manage.
but the dwarfs only started to sing.
And can you not do that? You'll blunt them. Ooh, do you hear that, lads? He says we'll blunt the knives.
Blunt the knives, bend the forks, smash the bottles and burn the corks, the glasses and crack the plates. That's what Bilbo Baggins hates. Cut the cloth, trail the hat, leave the room to the bedroom mat, pour them into the pantry floor. Splash the wine on every door, dunk across the boiling bowl, pound them up with a thumping bowl. When you're finished with the
And of course they did none of these dreadful things, and everything was clean and put away safe as quick as lightning, while the hobbit was turning round and round in the middle of the kitchen trying to see what they were doing. Then they went back and found Thorin, with his feet on the fender smoking a pipe. He was blowing the most enormous smoke rings, and wherever he told one to go, it went up the chimney or behind the clock on the mantelpiece, or under the table, or round and round the ceiling. But wherever it went, it was not quick enough to escape Gandalf. Pop! He sent a smaller smoke ring from his short clay pipe, straight through each one of Thorin's. Then Gandalf's smoke ring would go green and come back to hover over the wizard's head. He had a cloud of them about him already. and in the dim light it made him look strange and sorcerous. Bilbo stood still and watched. He loved smoke rings, and then he blushed to think how proud he had been yesterday morning of the smoke rings he had sent up the wind over the hill.
Now for some music.
Said Thorin.
Bring out the instruments.
Gilly and Philly rushed off their backs and brought back little fiddles. Dori, Nori, and Ori brought out flutes from somewhere inside their coats. Bombur produced a drum from the hole. Bifor and Bofor went out too, and came back with clarinets that they had left among the walking sticks. Dwelling and Balin said,
Excuse me, I left mine in the porch.
Just bring mine in with you.
Said Thorin. They came back with vials as big as themselves, and with Thorin's harp wrapped in a green cloth. It was a beautiful golden harp, and when Thorin struck in the music began all at once, so sudden and sweet that Bilbo forgot everything else, and was swept away into the dark lands under strange moons, far over the water and very far from his hobbit hole under the hill.
The dark came into the room from the little window that opened in the side of the hill. The firelight flickered. It was April, and still they played on, while the shadow of Gandalf's beard wagged against the wall. The dark filled all the room, and the fire died down, and the shadows were lost, and still they played on. And suddenly, first one and then another began to sing as they played, deep-throated singing of the dwarfs in the deep places of their ancient homes. And this is like a fragment of their song, if it can be like their song without their music.
Mountains cold, to dungeons deep and caverns old, we must away ere break of day to find our long forgotten gold. The pines were roaring on the height. The winds were moaning in the night. The fire was red, it flaming spread. The trees like torches blazed with light.
As they sang, the hobbit felt the love of beautiful things made by hands and by cunning and by magic moving through him, a fierce and a jealous love, the desire of the hearts of dwarfs. Then something Tookish woke up inside him, and he wished to go and see the great mountains and hear the pine trees and the waterfalls, and explore the caves and wear a sword instead of a walking stick. He looked out of the window. The stars were out in the dark sky above the trees. He thought of the jewels of the dwarfs shining in the dark caverns. Suddenly, in the wood beyond the water, a flame leaped up. Probably somebody lighting a wood fire, and he thought of plundering dragons settling on his quiet hill and clinging it all to flames. He shuddered, and very quickly he was plain Mr. Baggins of Bag End under hill again.
He got up trembling. He had less than half a mind to fetch the lamp, and more than half a mind to pretend to, and go and hide behind the beer barrels in the cellar, and not come out again until the dwarfs had gone away. Suddenly, he found that the music and the singing had stopped, and they were all looking at him with eyes shining in the dark.
"Where are you going?"
said Thorin, in a tone that seemed to show that he guessed both halves of the hobbit's mind.
"What about a little light?"
said Bilbo apologetically.
We like the dark.
Said all the dwarfs.
Dark for dark business. There are many hours before dawn.
"Of course,"
said Bilbo, and sat down in a hurry. He missed the stool and sat in the fender, knocking over the poker and shovel with a crash.
"Hush!"
said Gandalf.
"Let Thorin speak."
And this is how Thorin began.
Gandalf, dwarfs, and Mr. Baggins, we are met together in the house of our friend and fellow conspirator, this most excellent and audacious hobbit. May the hair on his toes never fall out. All praise to his wine and ale.
He polite remark from the hobbit, but the compliments were quite lost on poor Bilbo Baggins, who was wagging his mouth in protest at being called audacious, and worst of all, fellow conspirator. Though no noise came out, he was so flummoxed. So Thorin went on.
We are met to discuss our plans, our ways, means, policy, and devices. We shall soon before the break of day start on our long journey, a journey from which some of us, or perhaps all of us, except our friend and counselor the ingenious wizard Gandalf, may never return. It is a solemn moment. Our object is, I take it, well known to us all. To the estimable Mr. Baggins and perhaps to one or two of the younger dwarfs, I think I should be right in naming Killy and Philly for instance, the exact situation at the moment may require a little brief explanation.
This was Thorin's style. He was an important dwarf. If he had been allowed, he would probably have gone on like this until he was out of breath, without telling anyone there anything that was not known already. But he was rudely interrupted. Poor Bilbo couldn't bear it any longer. At May never returned, he began to feel a shriek coming up inside, and very soon it burst out like the whistle of an engine coming out of a tunnel. All the dwarfs sprang up, knocking over the table. Gandalf struck a blue light on the end of his magic staff, and in its firework glare the poor little hobbit could hard rock, shaking like a jelly that was melting. Then he fell flat on the floor and kept up calling out,
Struck by lightning! Struck by lightning!
over and over again. And that was all they could get out of him for a long time. So they took him and laid him out of the way on the drawing room sofa with a drink at his elbow, and they went back to their dark business.
"Excitable little fellow,"
said Gandalf as they sat down again.
"Gets funny queer fits, but he's one of the best. One of the best, as fierce as a dragon in a pinch."
If you have ever seen a dragon in a pinch, you will realize that this was only poetical exaggeration applied to any hobbit, even to old Took's great-grand-uncle Bolrower, who was so huge for a hobbit that he could ride a horse. He charged the ranks of the goblins of Mount Graham in the Battle of the Green Fields, and knocked their king, Golfinbull's head clean off with a wooden club. It sailed 100 yards through the air and went down a rabbit hole, and in this way the battle was won and the game of golf invented at the same moment.
In the meanwhile, however, Bullroar's gentler descendant was reviving in the drawing room. After a while, and a drink, he crept nervously to the door on the parlor. This is what he heard, Glowing speaking. Or some snort more or less like that.
Will he do you think? It is all very well for Gandalf to talk about this hobbit being fierce, but one shriek like that in a moment of excitement would wake the dragon and all his relatives and kill the lot of us. I think it sounded more like fright than excitement. In fact, if it had not been for the sign on the door, I should have been sure we had come to the wrong house. As soon as I clapped eyes on the little fellow bobbing and puffing on the mat, I had my doubts. He looks more like a
Then Mr. Baggins turned the handle and went in. The Took side had won. He suddenly felt he would go without bed and breakfast to be thought fierce. As for little fellow bobbing on the mat, it almost made him really fierce. Many a time afterwards, the Baggins part regret that he did now, and he said to himself,
Bilbo, you were a fool. You walked right in and put your foot in it. Pardon me,
he said,
if I have overhead words that you were saying. I don't pretend to understand what you are talking about, or your reference to burglars, but I think I am right in believing
This is what he called being on his dignity.
that you think I am no good. I will show you. I have no signs on my door. It was painted a week ago. And I am quite sure you have come to the wrong house. As soon as I saw your funny faces on the doorstep, I had my doubts. But treat it as the right one. Tell me what you want done and I will try it. If I have to walk from here to the east of east and fight the wild werewolves in the last desert, I had a great-great-great-grand-uncle once, Burrower took, and
Yes, but that was long ago.
Said glowing.
I was talking about you. And I assure you there is a mark on this door, the usual one in the trade, or used to be. Job, plenty of excitement and reasonable reward. That's how it is usually read. You can say instead of some of them do. It's all the same to us. Gandalf told us that there was a man of the sword in these parts looking for a job at once, and that he had arranged for a meeting here this Wednesday tea time.
Of course there is a mark.
Said Gandalf.
I put it there myself, for very good reasons. You asked me to find 14 men for your expedition, and I chose Mr. Baggins. Just let anyone say I chose the wrong man or the wrong house, and you can stop at 13 and have all the bad luck you like, or go back to digging
He
coal.
scolded so angrily at Glowing that the dwarf huddled back in his chair, and when Bilbo tried to open his mouth to ask a question, he turned in front of at him and stuck out his bushy eyebrows, till Bilbo shut his mouth tight with a snap.
That's right.
Said Gandalf.
Let's have no more argument. I have chosen Mr. Baggins, and that ought to be enough for all of you. If I said he's a burglar he is, or will be when the time comes. There is a lot more in him than you guess, and a deal more than he has any idea of himself. You may, possibly, all live to thank me yet. Now, Bilbo, my boy, fetch the lamp, and let's have a little light on this.
On the table, in the light of a big lamp with a red shade, he spread a piece of parchment rather like a map.
This was made by Thor, your grandfather, Thor.
He said in answer to the dwarf's excited questions.
It is a plan of the mountain.
I don't see that this will help us much.
Said Thorin disappointedly after a glance.
I remember the mountain well enough and the lands about it, and I know where Mirkwood is and the Wither Heath where the great dragon's breath.
There is a dragon mark in red on the mountain,
Said Balin.
but it will be easy enough to find him without that, if ever we arrive there.
There is one point that you haven't noticed,
Said the wizard.
and that is the secret entrance. You see that rune on the west side, and the hand pointing to it from the other runes. That marks a hidden passage to the lower halls.
It may have been secret once,
Said Thorin.
but how do we know that it is secret any longer? Old Smug has lived there long enough now to find out anything there is to know about those caves.
He may, but he can have used it for years and years.
Why?
Because it is too small. 5 feet hide the door, and 3 may walk abreast, said the runes. But Smoke could not creep into the hole that size, not even when he was a young dragon. Certainly not after devouring so many of the dwarfs and men of Dale.
It seems a great big hole to me.
Squeaked Bilbo, who had no experience of dragons and only of hobbit holes. He was getting excited and interested again, so that he forgot to keep his mouth shut. He loved maps, and in his hall there hung a large one of the country round, with all his favorite walks marked on it in red ink.
How could such a large door be kept secret from everybody outside apart from the dragon?
He asked. He was only a little hobbit, you must remember,
In lots of ways.
said Gandalf.
But in what way this one has been hidden, we don't know without going to see. From what it says on the map, I should guess there is a closed door which has been made to look exactly like the side of the mountain. That is the usual dwarf's method. I think that is right, isn't it?
Quite right,
said Thorin.
Also,
Went on Gandalf.
I forgot to mention that with the map went a key, a small and curious key. Here it is.
He said, and handed to Thorin a key with a long barrel and intricate wars made of silver.
Keep it safe.
Indeed I will,
said Thorin, and he fastened it upon a fine chain that hung about his neck and under his jacket.
Now things begin to look more hopeful. This news altered them much for the better. So far we have had no clear idea what to do. We thought of going east, as quiet and careful as we could, as far as the Long Lake. After that the trouble would begin.
A long time before that, if I know anything about the roads east.
Interrupted Gandalf.
We might go from there up along the river running,
Went on Thorin, taking no notice.
and so to the ruins of Dale, the old town in the valley there under the shadow of the mountain. But we none of us like the idea of the front gate. The river runs right out of it through the great cliff at the south of the mountain, and out of it comes the dragon too, far too often, unless he has changed his habits.
That would be no good.
Said the wizard.
Not without a mighty warrior, even a hero. I tried to find one, but warriors are busy fighting one another in distant lands, and in his neighborhood heroes are scarce, or simply not to be found. Swords in this part are mostly blunt, and axes are used for trees. And shields as cradles or dish covers, and dragons are comfortably far off, and therefore legendary. That is why I settle on burglary, especially when I remember the existence of a side door. And here is our little Bilbo Baggins, the burglar, the chosen, and the selected burglar. So now let's get on and make some plans.
Very well then.
Said Thorin.
Supposing the burglar expert gives us some ideas or suggestions.
He turned with mock politeness to Bilbo.
First I should like to know a bit more about things.
Said he, feeling all confused and a bit shaky inside, but so far still turkishly determined to go on with things.
I mean about the gold and the dragon and all that, and how it got there and who it belongs to and so on and further. Bless me,
Said Thorin.
haven't you got a map? And didn't you hear our songs? And haven't we been talking about all this for hours? All the same, I should like it all plain and clear.
Said he absently, putting on his business manner, usually reserved for people who try to borrow money of him, and doing his best to appear wise and prudent and professional and live up to Gandalf's recommendation.
Also, I should like to know about risks, out-of-pocket expenses, time required and remuneration, and so forth.
By which he meant,
What am I going to get out of it? And am I going to come back alive? Oh, very well.
said Thorin.
Long ago, in my grandfather Thor's time, our family was driven out of the far north and came back with all their wealth and their tools to this mountain on the map. It had been discovered by my far ancestors, Rain the Old. But now they mined and they tunneled and they made huger holes and greater workshops. And in addition, I believe they found a good deal of gold and a great many jewels too. Anyway, they grew immensely rich and famous, and my grandfather was king under the mountain again, and treated with great reverence by the mortal men, who lived to the south and were gradually spreading up to the running river as far as the valley overshadowed by the mountain. They built the merry town of Dale there in those days. Kings used to send for our smiths and reward even the least skillful most richly. Fathers would beg us to take their sons as apprentices and pay us handsomely, especially in food supplies which we never bothered to grow or find for ourselves. Altogether, those were good days for us, and the poorest of us had money to spend and to lend, and leisure to make beautiful things just for the fun of it, not to speak of the most marvelous and magical toys. the like of which is not to be found in the world nowadays. So my grandfather's halls became full of armor and jewels and carving and cups, and the toy market of Dale was the wonder of the north. Undoubtedly that was what brought the dragon. Dragons steal gold and jewels, you know, from men and elves and dwarfs, wherever they can find them, and they guard their plunders as long as they live, which is practically forever unless they are killed, and never enjoy a brass ring of it. Indeed, they hardly know a good bit of work from a bath, though they usually have a good notion of the current market value, and they can't make a thing for themselves, not even mend a little loose scale of their armor. There were lots of dragons in the north in those days, and gold was probably getting scarce up there, with the dwarfs flying south and getting killed, and all the general waste and destruction that dragons make going from bad to worse. There was a most especially greedy, strong, and wicked worm called Smoke. One day he flew up into the air and came south. The first we heard of it was a noise like a hurricane coming from the north, and the pine trees on the mountain creaking and cracking in the wind. Some of the dwarfs who happened to be outside, I was one luckily, a fine adventurous lad in those days, always wandering about, and it saved my life that day. Well, from a good way off we saw the dragon settle on our mountain in a spout of flame. Then he came down the slopes, and when we reached the woods they all went up in fire. By that time all the bells were ringing in Dale, and the warriors were arming. The dwarfs rushed out of their great gate, but there was the dragon waiting for them. None escaped that way. The river rushed up in steam, and a fog fell on Dale, and in the fog the dragon came on them and destroyed most of the warriors. The usual unhappy story. It was only too common in those days. Then he went back and crept in through the front gate, and routed out all the holes, the lanes, and tunnels, alleys, cellars, mansions, and passages. After that there were no dwarfs left alive inside, and he took all their wealth for himself. Probably, for that is the dragon's way, he has piled it all up in a great heap far inside, and sleeps on it for a bed. Later he used to crawl out of the great gate and come by night to Dale, and carry away people, especially maidens, to it, until Dale was ruined and all the people dead or gone. What goes on there now I don't know for certain, but I don't suppose anyone lives nearer to the mountain than the far edge of the long lake nowadays. The few of us that were well outside sat and wept in hiding, and cursed Smoke, and there we were unexpectedly joined by my father and my grandfather with Saint Bird. They looked very grim, but they said very little. When we asked how they had got away, they told me to hold my tongue, and said that one day, in the proper time, I should know. After that we went away, and we have had to earn our livings as best as we could up and down the lands, often enough sinking as low as blacksmith work or even coal mining. But we have never forgotten our stolen treasure, and even now, when I will allow we have a good bit laid by and are not so badly off.
Here Thorin struck the gold chain round his neck.
We still mean to get it back, and to bring our curses home to Smoke if we can. I have often wondered about my father's and my grandfather's cape. I see now they must have had a private side door, which only they knew about, but apparently they made a map, and I should like to know how Gandalf got hold of it, and why it did not come down to me, the rightful heir.
I did not get hold of it, I was given it.
Said the wizard.
Your grandfather Thord was killed, you remember, in the mines of Moria by Azog the Goblin.
Curse his name, yes.
Said Thorin.
And Thorin, your father, went away on the 21st of April, 100 years ago last Thursday, and has never been seen by you since.
True, true.
Said Thorin.
Well, your father gave me this to give to you, and if I have chosen my own time and way for handing it over, you can hardly blame me, considering the trouble I have to find you. Your father could not remember his own name when he gave me that paper, and he never told me yours, so on the whole I think I ought to be praised and thanked. Here it is.
Said he, handing the map to Thorin.
I don't understand.
Said Thorin, and Bilbo felt he would have liked to say the same. The explanation did not seem to explain,
Your grandfather
said the wizard slowly and grimly.
gave the map to his son for safety before he went to the mines of Moria. Your father went away to try his luck with the map after your grandfather was killed, and lots of adventures of a most unpleasant sort he had, but he never got near the mountain. How he got there I don't know, but I found him a prisoner in the dungeons of the necromancer.
Whatever were you doing there?
Asked Thorin with a shudder, and all the dwarfs shivered.
Never you mind, I was finding things out, as usually, and a nasty dangerous business it was. Even I, Gandalf, only just escaped. I tried to save your father, but it was too late. He was witless and wandering, and had forgotten almost everything except the map and the key.
We have long ago paid the goblins of Moria.
Said Thorin.
We must give a thought to the necromancer.
Don't be absurd. He's an enemy far beyond the powers of all the dwarfs put together. If they could all be collected again from the four corners of the world. The one thing your father wished was for his son to read the map and use the key. The dragon and the mountain are more than big enough to take tasks for you.
Here, here!
Said Bilbo, accidentally said it aloud.
Hear what?
They all said, turning suddenly towards him, and he was so flustered that he answered.
Hear what I have got to say.
What's that?
They asked.
Well, I should say that you ought to go east and have a look round. After all, there is a side door, and dragons must sleep sometimes, I suppose. If you sit on the doorstep long enough, I dare say you will think of something. And well, you don't know. I think we have talked long enough for one night, if you see what I mean. What about bed? And an early start and all that. I will give you a good breakfast before you go. Before we go, I suppose you mean.
Said Thorin.
Aren't you the burglar? And isn't sitting on the doorstep your job, not to speak of getting inside the door? But I agree about bed and breakfast. I like 6 eggs with my ham, when starting on a journey. Fried, not poached, and mind you don't break 'em.
After all the others had ordered their breakfast without so much as a please, which annoyed Bilbo very much, they all got up. The Hobbit had to find room for them all, and filled all his spare rooms and made beds on chairs and sofas, before he got them all stowed and went to his own little bed very tired and not altogether happy. One thing he did make his mind up about was not to bother to get up very early and cook everybody else's wretched breakfast. The 2 niches was well enough, and he was not now quite so sure that he was going on any journey in the morning. As he lay in bed, he could hear Thorin still humming to himself in the best bedroom next to him.
Far over the misty mountains cold, to dungeons deep and caverns old, we must away ere break of day, to find our long forgotten gold. The pines.
Bilbo went to sleep with that in his ears, and it gave him very uncomfortable dreams. It was long after the break of day when he woke up.
Chapter 2. Rose Mutton. Up jumped Bilbo and putting on his dressing gown went into the dining room. There he saw nobody, but all the signs of a large and hurried breakfast. There was a fearful mess in the room and piles of unwashed crock in the kitchen. Nearly every pot and pan he possessed seemed to have been used. The washing up was so dismally real that Bilbo was forced to believe the party of the night before had not been part of his bad dreams, as he had rather hoped. Indeed, he was really relieved after all to think that they had all gone without him, and without bothering to wake him up.
but with never a thank you,
he thought, and yet in a way he could not help feeling just a trifle disappointed. The feeling surprised him.
Don't be a fool, Bilbo Baggins,
He said to himself.
thinking of dragons and all that outlandish nonsense at your age.
So he put on an apron, lit fires, boiled water, and washed up. Then he had a nice little breakfast in the kitchen before turning out the dining room. By that time, the sun was shining and the front door was open, letting in a warm spring breeze. Bilbo began to whistle loudly and to forget about the night before. In fact, he was just sitting down to a nice little second breakfast in the dining room by the open window when it walked Gandalf.
My dear fellow,
Said he,
whenever are you going to come? What about an early start? And here you are having breakfast, or whatever you call it, at 10:30. They left you the message because they could not wait.
What message?
said poor Mr. Baggins, all in a fluster.
Great elephants!
Said Gandalf.
You are not all yourself this morning. You have never dusted the mantelpiece.
What's that got to do with it? I have had enough to do with washing up for 14.
If you had dusted the mantelpiece, you would have found this under the clock.
Said Gandalf, handing Bilbo a note, written, of course, at his own note paper. This is what he read.
Thorin and Company to Burglar Bilbo greeting. For your hospitality our sincerest thanks, and for your offer of professional assistance or grateful acceptance. Terms: cash on delivery up to and not exceeding 1/14 of total profits, if any. All traveling expenses guaranteed in any event. Funeral expenses to be defrayed by us or our representatives, if occasion arises and the matter is not otherwise arranged for. Thinking it unnecessary to disturb your esteemed repose, we have proceeded in advance to make requisite preparations and shall await your respected person at the Green Dragon Inn, Bywater, at 11 a.m. sharp, trusting that you will be punctual. We have the honor to remain yours deeply, Thorin and Company.
That leaves you just 10 minutes. You will have to run.
Said Gandalf.
But,
Said Bilbo.
No time for it.
Said the wizard.
but,
Said Bilbo again.
No time for that either. Off you go.
To the end of his date, Bilbo could never remember how he found himself outside, without a hat, a walking stick, or any money, or anything that he usually took when he went out, leaving his second breakfast half finished and quite unwashed up, pushing his keys into Gandalf's hands and running as fast as his hurried feet could carry him, down the lane, past the great mill, across the water, and then on for a mile or more.
Very puffed he was when he got to Bywater just on the stroke of 11, and found he had come without a pocket handkerchief.
Bravo!
Said Balin, who was standing at the inn door looking out for him. Just then all the others came round the corner of the road from the village. They were on ponies, and each pony was slung about with all kinds of packages, parcels, and paraphernalia. There was a very small pony, apparently for Bilbo.
up you to get, and off we go.
Said Thorin.
I am awfully sorry,
Said Bilbo.
but I have come without my hat, and I have left my pocket handkerchief behind, and I haven't got any money. I didn't get your note until after 10:45 to be precise.
Don't be precise,
Said Dwelling.
and don't worry. You will have to manage without and a good many other things before you get into the journey's end. As for a hat, I have got a spare hood and cloak in my luggage. That's how they all came to start, jogging off from the inn one fire morning just before May, on laden ponies, and Bilbo was wearing a dark green hood, a little weather-stained, and a dark green cloak, borrowed from Dwalin. They were too large for him, and he looked rather comic. But his father Bungo would have thought of him, I daren't think. His only comfort was he couldn't be mistaken for a dwarf, as he had no beard. They had not been riding very long when up came Gandalf, very splendid on a white horse. He had brought a lot of pocket handkerchiefs and Bilbo's pipe and tobacco. So after that the party went along very merrily, and they told stories or sang songs as they rode forward all day, except of course when they stopped for meals. This didn't come quite as often as Bilbo would have liked them, but still he began to feel that adventures were not so bad after all. At first they had passed through Hobbit lands, a white respectable country inhabited by decent folk, with good roads, an inn or two, and now and then a dwarf or a farmer ambling by on business. Then they came to lands where people spoke strangely and sang songs Bilbo had never heard before. Now they had gone on far into the lone lands, where there were no people left, no inns, and the roads grew steadily worse. Not far ahead were dreary hills, rising higher and higher, dark with trees. On some of them were old castles with an evil look, as if they had been built by wicked people. Everything seemed gloomy, for the weather that day had taken a nasty turn. Mostly it had been as good as May can be, even in merry tales, but now it was cold and wet. In the lone islands they had been obliged to camp when they could, but at least it had been dry.
To think it will soon be June,
grumbled Bilbo as he splashed along behind the others in a very muddy track. It was after tea time, it was pouring with rain, and had been all day. His hood was dripping into his eyes. His cloak was full of water. The pony was tired and stumbled on stones. The others were too grumpy to talk.
and I'm sure the rain has got into the dry clothes and into the food bags.
Thought Bilbo.
Bother burgling and everything to do with it. I wish I was at home in my nice hole by the fire with the kettle just beginning to sing.
It was not the last time that he wished that. Still the dwarfs jogged on, never turning round or taking any notice of the hobbit. Somewhere behind the grey clouds the sun must have gone down, for it began to get dark as they went down into a deep valley with a river at the bottom. Wind got up, and willows along its banks bent aside. Fortunately, the road went over an ancient stone bridge, for the river, swollen with rains, came rushing down from the hills and mountains in the north. It was nearly night when they had crossed over. The wind broke up the grey clouds, and a wandering moon appeared above the hills between the flying rags. Then they stopped, and Thorin muttered something about supper.
And where shall we get a dry patch to sleep on?
Not until they noticed that Gandalf was missing. So far he had come all the way with them, never saying if he was in the adventure or merely keeping them company for a while. He had eaten most, talked most, and laughed most, but now he simply was not there at all.
Just when a wizard would have been most useful too,
groaned Dori and Nori, who shared the hobbit's view about regular meals, plenty and often. They decided in the end that they would have to camp where they were. They moved to a clump of trees, and though it was drier under them, the wind shook the rain off the leaves, and the drip was most annoying. Also the mischief seemed to have got into the fire. Dwarfs can make a fire almost everywhere, out of almost anything, wind or not wind, but they could not do it that night, not even Oin and Gloin, who were especially good at it. Then one of the ponies took fright and nothing and bolted. He got into the river before they could catch him, and before they could get him out. Phil and Killy were nearly drowned, and all the baggage that he carried was washed away of him. Of course, it was mostly food, and there was mightily little left for supper, and less for breakfast. There they all sat glum and wet and muttering, while Oin and Gloin went on trying to light the fire and quarreling about it. Bilbo was sadly reflecting that adventures are not all pony rides in May sunshine, when Balin, who was always their lookout man, said,
"There's a light over there."
There was a hill some way off with trees on it, pretty thick in parts. Out of the dark mass of trees they could now see a light shining, a reddish comfortable looking light, as it might be a fire or torches twinkling. When they had looked at it for some while, they fell to arguing. Some said,
No!
and some said,
Yes!
some say they could but go and see, and anything was better than little supper, last breakfast, and wet clothes all the night. And others said,
These parts are none too well known, and are too near the mountains. Travelers seldom come this way now. The old maps are no use. Things have changed for the worse, and the road is unguarded. They have seldom even heard of the king round here, and the less inquisitive you are as you go along, the less trouble you are likely to find.
some said,
After all, there are 14 of us.
others said.
Where has Gandalf got to?
This remark was repeated by everybody. Then the rain began to pour down worse than ever, and Oin and Gloin began to fight. That settled it,
After all, we have got a burglar with us.
they said. And so they made off, leading their ponies, with all due and proper caution, in the direction of the light. They came to the hill and were soon in the wood. Up the hill they went, but there was no proper path to be seen, such as might lead to a house or a farm, and do what they could they made a deal of rustling and crackling and creaking, and good deal of rumbling and ratting, as they went through the trees in the pitch dark. Suddenly the red light shone out very bright through the tree's trunk, not far ahead.
Now it is the burglar's turn.
They said, meaning Bilbo.
You must go on and find out all about that light, and what it is for, and if all is perfectly safe and canny.
Said Thorin to the Hobbit.
Now scuttle off, and come back quick, if all is well. If not, come back if you can. If you can't, hoot twice like a barn owl, and once like a screech owl, and we will do what we can.
Off Bilbo had to go, before he could explain that he could not hoot even once like any kind of owl, any more than fly like a bat. But at any rate, hobbits can move quietly in woods, absolutely quietly. They take a pride in it, and Bilbo had sniffed more than once at what he called,
All this dwarvish racket.
as they went along, though I don't suppose notice anything at all on a windy night, not if the whole cavalcade had passed 2 feet off. As for Bilbo, walking primly towards the red light, I don't suppose even a weasel would have stirred a whisker at it. So naturally, he got right up to the fire, for fire it was, without disturbing anyone, and this is what he saw. 3 very large persons sitting around a very large fire of beech logs. They were toasting mutton on long spits of wood, and licking the gravy off their fingers. There was a fine toothsome smell. Also, there was a barrel of good drink at hand, and they were drinking out of jugs. But they were trolls. Obviously trolls. Even Bilbo, in spite of his sheltered life, could see that, from the great heavy faces of them, and their size, and the shape of their legs, not to mention their language, which was not drawing room fashion at all, at all.
Mutton yesterday, mutton today, and blimey, if it don't look like mutton against tomorrow,
said one of the trolls.
Never a blinking bit of man-flesh have we had for long enough,
said a second.
What the hell, William, was it thinking of to bring us into these parts at all? Beats me. And the drink running short. What's more?
He said, jogging the elbow of William, who was taking a pull at his jug. William chucked.
Shut your mouth.
He said as soon as he could.
You can expect folk to stop here forever just to be ate by you and Bert. You bet a village and a half between ye since we come down from the mountains. How much more dear want, and time's been up our way, when ye have said, thank ye, Bill, for a nice bit of fat bully mutton like what this is.
He took a big bite off a sheep's leg he was roasting and whipped his lips on his lip. Yes, I am afraid trolls do behave like that, even those with only one head each. After hearing all this, Bilbo ought to have done something at once. Either he should have gone back quietly and warned his friends that there were 3 third-sized trolls at hand in an estimate, quite likely to try roasted dwarf or even pony for a change, or else he should have done a bit of good quick burgling. A really first-class and legendary burglar would at this point have picked a troll's pocket. It is nearly always worthwhile if you can manage it. Pinched the very mutton of the spits, purloined the beer, and walked off without their noticing him. Others more practical, but with less professional pride, would perhaps have stuck a dagger into each of them before they observed it. Then the night could have been spent cheerily. Bilbo knew it. He had read a good many things he had never seen or done. He was very much alarmed as well as disgusted. He wished himself 100 miles away, and yet somehow he could not go straight back to Thorin and company empty-handed. So he stood and hesitated in the shadow. Of the various bulgarious proceedings he had heard of picking the troll's pocket seemed the least difficult, so at last he crept behind a tree just behind William. Bert and Tom went off to the barrel. William was having another drink. Then Bilbo plucked up courage and put his little hand in William's enormous pocket. There was a purse in it, as big as a bag to Bilbo.
Ha!
Thought he, warming to his new work as he lifted it carefully out.
This is a beginning.
It was. Trolls' purses are the mischief, and this was no expectation.
Oh, are you?
It squeaked as it left the pocket, and William turned round at once and grabbed Bilbo by the neck, before he could duck behind the tree.
Blimey, Bert, look what I've caught,
said William.
What is it?
Said the others coming up.
Loom, if I knows, what are ya?
Bilbo Baggins, a hobbit, said poor Bilbo, shaking all over and wondering how to make owl noises before they throttled him.
A hobbit?
Said they a bit startled. Trolls are slow in the uptake and mighty suspicious about anything new to them.
What's a barahit got to do with my pocket, anyways?
Said William.
And can you cook them?
Said Tom.
You can try.
Said Bert, picking up a skewer.
He wouldn't make about a mouthful.
Said William, who had already had a fine supper.
Not when he was skinned and boned.
Perhaps there are more like him around about, and we might make a pie.
Said Bert.
Here you are. There are any more of your sort are sneaking in these here woods. You nasty little rabbit,
said he, looking at the hobbit's furry feet, and he picked him up by the toes and shook him. Yes, lots,
said Bilbo before he remembered not to give his friends away.
No, not at all, not one,
he said immediately afterwards.
What do you mean?
Said Bert, holding him right way up by the hair this time.
What I say,
said Bilbo, gasping.
And please don't cook me, kind sirs. I am a good cook myself, and cook better than I cook, if you see what I mean. I'll cook beautifully for you, and perfectly beautiful breakfast for you, if only you won't have me for supper.
Poor little Blacker,
said William. He had already had as much supper as he could hold. Also, he had lots of beer.
Poor little Blacker, let him go.
Not till he says what he means by lots and none at all,
said Bert.
I don't want to have me throat caught in me sleep. Toss his toes in the fire till he talks.
I won't have it,
said William.
I caught him anyway.
You're a fat fool, William,
said Bert.
as I've said before this evening,
And you're allowed.
and I won't take that from you, Bill Huggins.
says Bert and puts him fist in William's eyes. Then there was a gorgeous row. Bilbo had just enough wits left when Bert dropped him on the ground to scramble out of the way of their feet before they were fighting like dogs and calling one another all sorts of perfectly true and applicable names in very loud voices. Soon they were locked in one another's arms and rolling nearly into the fire, kicking and thumping, while Tom whacked at them both with a branch to bring them to their senses, and that, of course, only made them madder than ever. That would have been the first time for Bilbo to have left, but his poor little feet had been very squashed in Bert's big paw, and he had no breath in his body, and his head was going round, so there he lay for a while, panting, just outside the circle of firelight. Right in the middle of the fight up came Balin. The dwarfs had heard noises from a distance, and after waiting for some time for Bilbo to come back, or to hoot like an owl, they started off one by one to creep towards the light as quietly as they could. No sooner did Tom see Balin come into the light than he gave an awful howl. Trolls simply detest the very sight of dwarfs, uncooked. Bert and Bill stopped fighting immediately, and
Attack them! Quick!
they said, before Balin, who was wondering where in all this commotion Bilbo was, knew what was happening. A sack was over his head, and he was down. "There's more to come yet,"
said Tom.
"or I might mistook. Lots of none at all it is.
Said he.
No Bora hobbits, but lots of these here dwarfs. There's about the shape of it."
I reckon you're right.
Said Bert.
And we'd best get out of the light.
And so they did, with sacks in their hands that they used for carrying off mutton and other plunder. They waited in the shadows. As each dwarf came up and looked at the fire and the spilled jugs and the not mutton in surprise, pop went a nasty smell sack over his head, and he was down. Soon Dwalin lay by Balin, and Fili and Kili together, and Dori and Nori and Ori all in a heap, and Oin and Gloin and Bifur and Bofur and Bombur piled uncomfortably near the fire.
"That'll teach them,"
said Tom, for Bifur and Bomber had given a lot of trouble and fought like mad, as dwarfs will when cornered. Thorin came last, and he was not caught unaware. He came expecting mischief and didn't need to see his friend's legs sticking out of sacks to tell him that things were not all well. He stood outside in the shadows some way off and said,
"What's all this trouble? Who has been knocking my people about?"
"It's trolls," said Bilbo from behind a tree. They had forgotten all about him.
"They're hiding in the bushes with sacks,"
said he.
"Oh, are they?"
said Thorin, and he jumped forward to the fire. Before they could leap of him, he caught up a big branch, all on fire at one end, and Bert got that end on his eye before he could step aside. That put him out of the battle for a bit. Bilbo did his best. He caught hold of Tom's leg as well as he could. It was thick as a young tree trunk, but he was spinning up into the top of some bushes when Tom kicked the sparks up in Thorin's face. Tom got the branch in his teeth for that, and lost one of the front ones. It made him whole, I can tell you. But just at the moment William came up behind and pooped a sack right over Thorin's head and down to his toes, and so the fight ended. A nice pickle they were all in now, all neatly tied up in sacks, with 3 angry trolls, and 2 with burns and bashes to remember, sitting by them, arguing whether they should roast them slowly, or mince them fine and boil them, or just sit on them one by one and squash them into jelly, and Bilbo up in a bush, with his clothes and his skin turned, not daring to move for fear they should hear him. It was just then that Gandalf came back, but no one saw him. The trolls had just decided to roast the dwarfs now and eat them later. That was Bert's idea, and after a lot of argument, they had all agreed to it.
No good roasting 'em now. It'll take all night,
said a voice. Bert thought it was William's.
Don't start the argument all over again, Bill,
He said.
or it will take all night.
Arguing!
Said William, who thought it was Bert that had spoken.
You are?
Said Bert.
You're a liar!
Said William, and so their argument began all over again. In the end, they decided to mince them fine and boil them. So they got a great black pot, and they took out their knives.
No good boiling 'em. We ain't got no water and it's a long way to the well and all,
said a voice. Bert and William thought it was Tom's.
Shut up!
Said they.
Or we'll never have done. And you can fetch the water yourself if you say any more.
Shut up yourself,
Said Tom, who thought it was William's voice.
Who's arguing but you, I'd like to know?
You're a booby!
said William. Booby yourself, said Tom. And so the argument began all over again and went on hotter than ever, until at last they decided to sit on the sacks one by one and squash them and boil them next time.
Who shall we sit on first?
Said the voice.
Better sit on the last fellow first,
Said Bert, whose eye had been damaged by Thorin. He thought Tom was talking.
Then talk to yourself.
Said Tom.
But if you want to sit on the last one, sit on him. Which is he?
the one with the yellow stockings.
Nonsense. The one with the grey stocking.
Said a voice like William's.
I made sure it was yellow.
Said Bert.
Yellow it was.
Said William.
Then what did you say it was great for?
Said Bert.
I never did. Tom said it.
That I never did.
Said Tom.
It was you.
2-1, so shut your mouth.
Said Bert.
Who are you talking to?
Said William.
Now stop it.
Said Tom and Bert together.
The night getting on and down comes early. Let's get on with it. Down take you all and be stoned to you.
Said a voice that sounded like William's, but it wasn't. For just at that moment the light came over the hill, and there was a mighty twitter in the branches. William never spoke, for he stood turned to stone as he stopped, and Bert and Tom were stuck like rocks as they looked at him. And where they stand to this day, all alone, unless the birds perch on them, for trolls, as you probably know, must be underground before dawn, or they go back to the stuff on the mountains they are made of, and never move again. That is what had happened to Bert and Tom and William.
Excellent,
said Gandalf, as he stepped from behind a tree and helped Bilbo to climb down out of a thorn bush. Then Bilbo understood. It was the wizard's voice that had kept the trolls bickering and quarreling until the light came and made an end of them. The next thing was to untie the sacks and let out the dwarfs. They were nearly suffocated and very annoyed. They had not at all enjoyed lying there listening to the trolls making plans for roasting them and squashing them and mincing them. They had to hear Bilbo's account of what had happened to him twice over before they were satisfied.
Silly time to go practicing pinching and pocket picking,
said Bomber,
when what he wanted was fire and food.
And that's just what you wouldn't have got of those fellows without struggle in any case,
said Gandalf.
Anyhow, you are wasting time now. Don't you realize that the trolls must have a cave or a hole dug somewhere near to hide from the sun in? We must look into it.
They searched about and soon found the marks of trolls' stony boots going away through the trees. They followed the tracks up the hill until, hidden by bushes, they came on a big door of stone leading to a cave. But they could not open it, not though they all pushed while Gandalf tried various incantations.
Would this be any good?
asked Bilbo when they were getting tired and angry.
I found it on the ground where the trolls had their fight.
He held out a largish key, though no doubt Willem had thought it very small and secret. It must have fallen out of his pocket, very luckily, before he was turned to stone.
Why on earth didn't you mention it before?
They cried. Gandalf grabbed it and fit it into the keyhole. Then the stone door swung back with one big push, and they all went inside. There were bones on the floor, and a nasty smell was in the air. But there was a good deal of food jumbled carelessly on shelves and on the ground, among an untidy litter of plunder, of all sorts from brass buttons to pots full of gold coins standing in a corner. There were lots of clothes, too, hanging on the walls, too small for trolls. I am afraid they belonged to victims. And among them were several swords for various makes, shapes, and sizes. Two caught their eyes particularly because of their beautiful scabbards and jewel hilts. Gandalf and Thorin each took one of these, and Bilbo took a knife in a leather sheath. It would have made only a tiny pocket knife for a troll, but it was as good as a short sword for the hobbit.
These look like good blades,
said the wizard, half drawing them and looking at them curiously.
They were not made by any troll, nor by any smith among men in these parts some days, but when we can read the runes on them, we shall know more about them.
Let's get out of this horrible smell, said Philly, so they carried out the pots of coins, and such food as was untouched and looked fit to eat. Also 1 barrel of ale, which was still full. By that time they felt like breakfast, and being very hungry, they did not turn their noses up at what they had got from the troll's larder. Their own provisions were very scanty. Now they had bread and cheese, and plenty of ale, and bacon to toast in the embers of the fire. After that they slept, for their night had been disturbed, and they did nothing more till the afternoon. Then they brought up their ponies, and carried away the post of gold, and buried them very secretly not far from the track by the river, putting a great many spells over them, just in case they ever had a chance to come back and recover them. When that was done, they all mounted once more, and jogged along again on the path towards the east.
Where did you go to, if I may ask?
Said Thorin to Gandalf as they rode along.
To look ahead,
said he.
And what brought you back in the nick of time?
Looking behind,
said he.
Exactly,
said Thorin.
But could you be more plain?
I went on to spy out our road. It will soon become dangerous and difficult. Also, I was anxious about replenishing our small stock of provisions. I had not gone very far, however, when I met a couple of friends of mine from Riverdale.
Where's that?
asked Bilbo.
Don't interrupt,
said Gandalf.
You will get there in a few days now, if we're lucky, and find out all about it. As I was saying, I met 2 of Elrond's people. They were hurrying along for fear of the trolls. It was they who told me that 3 of them had come down from the mountains and settled in the woods, not far from the road. They had frightened everyone away from the district, and they waylaid strangers. I immediately had a feeling that I was wanted back. Looking behind, I saw fire in the distance and made for it. So now you know. Please be more careful next time, or we shall never get anywhere.
Thank you,
said Thorin.